Meshechech Chochma for Parshas Vayeira will begin in Mirz Hashem, Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud. So let's open up the Chumash, and we'll see that in the first section of Parshas Vayeira, the Malachim come, and one of them is in charge of telling Avram and Sarah about the birth of a son, and the pasuk says the following: Vayomru elav ayei Sarah ishtecha vayomer hinei ba'ohel vayomer shov ashuv elecha keis chaya v'hinei vein l'Sarah ishtecha v'Sarah shomas pesach ha'ohel v'hu acharav. One of the very strange things here is the last two words in this pasuk, v'hu acharav. It seems to be nowhere. Doesn't add anything. It doesn't have any meaning. But Meir Simcha says the following: Yitochen l'dati. It's possible, he says, that the words here v'hu acharav at the end of pasuk Yud are a continuation of the words of the Malach, which is really strange in a sense, because the Malach opens up by saying in Pasuk Yud, Shov Ashuv Elecha Keis Chaya, V'nei Vein L'Sar Ishtecha. And then it says, V'Sar Shomas Pesach HaOel. Sar Shomas Pesach HaOel is not a word from the Malach, it's just a description of where Sarah is located. But again, Rabbi Simcha's agenda here is to make sense out of the words v'hu acharav. So he adds the v'hu acharav as an attachment to the beginning of the pasuk, so that the words of the Malach begin with "I will return to you at this point, at this time a year later, and you will have a son," and then v'hu acharav, he will be after you. So now the vahu goes back on the word ben. This is called, in the language of Chazal, sarsehu v'darshehu. And b'li neder, as we go through this piece in Rabbi Yosef, we'll try to give at least one other example of this kind of a methodology, where you take an end of the pasuk and you attach it to the beginning of the pasuk with the middle part that you're sort of like removing. So the Malach is saying, "V'hinei ben l'sar ishtecha v'hu acharav." What does this mean? V'hu acharav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time of the Milah, at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, tells Avram, "V'akimosi es brisi beini u'veinecha u'bein zaracha acharecha l'dorasam liosachem l'elkim u'lezaracha acharecha v'nasati l'chol u'lezaracha acharecha." Notice that the word acharecha appears 3 times in this very small unit of two psukim. And what's the emphasis on the word acharecha? Says Rabbi Meir Simcha that the word acharecha means that he will follow in your footsteps. He will, in effect, fill in for you and replace you and continue your legacy. And which ben is it? It's the ben that Sarah will give birth to. She will be the mother of this ben. Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, u'b'mekomo u'memale makomo. A memale makom is someone who could continue the exact contribution of the original. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu here, in this Malach, notifying Avram that they can have a son, wants Avram to understand that all the promises that he had given Avram at the end of Lech Lecha about L'zaracha acharecha were not referring to Yishmael. That's not Zaracha acharecha. But Zarach Achrecha is the ben that Sarah is going to give birth to. Masha Enken, Yishmael, and also there were other children that Avram had from Keturah. Heim Eino Acharecha. They're not considered Achra. Kihu, because Yishmael is Ben Ha'amah, and they are the Bnei Apilagsh, meaning the Bnei Keturah. So who's the Achrav that I was referring to 3 times over at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha? It's Vahu Acharav. It's this Ben that I'm notifying you now that you're going to have from Sarah. He's going to be the replacement Acharecha. He's going to fill in. He's going to step into your shoes. And now the question is, why does it say Vahu Acharav if the Malach is addressing Avram? It should be in first person. It should be Vahu Acharecha. He's talking to Avram, and he should say, well, this son that Sarah is going to give birth to, is going to be Acharecha. He's going to be after you. He's going to follow in your footsteps. Why does it say Vahu Acharav in third person? Second person would have been more appropriate. Shed Diber le Avram v'nochach, because he's speaking to Avram face to face. Oh, Lachein hifsika mamar. The Malach, as he's notifying Avram that Sarah will beget a son, he stops in the middle, and V'Sarah shomas Pesach Oel. What does this mean? She's listening. Diber HaMalach b'mechuvan shetishma Sarah. The Malach now turns in the direction of Sarah, who's in the Ohel, and now he's really talking to Sarah. So when it says Sarah shomas, it's critical from the Malach's perspective that she listened carefully to this Sarah Tova, this very good news, that she is going to be the mother of Acharecha. And therefore, if the Malach now is turning to Sarah and speaking and addressing Sarah, then Lenochach Sarah siyem vahu acharav. The word acharav is referring in third person to Avram Avinu. Vahu, Sarah, the son that you're going to give birth to, is going to be the replacement for Acharav, for him, meaning for your husband Avram. And this is an example in which Reb Meir Simcha, in a very original way, is taking apart a pasuk, and he's, in a sense, he's defining a wedge in the pasuk, meaning that there's a few words in the pasuk that give you more of the background information that you have to understand and appreciate the pasuk. And at the end of his presentation, he quotes the Lamed Beis Midos de Rabbi Eliezer Benocho Rabbi Yossi Aglili. In other words, that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, one of the great Tanoim, has a list of 32 different methodological principles, hermeneutic principles, by which you analyze the language of the Tanakh. And amongst the various principles is this principle called Sarseu V'Darsheu, where you can actually take a few psukim out of the context, and then you understand how the pasuk should be interpreted. Now, I'm a little bit at a crossroads, because what I found in the past, in this Shiur, is that I run out of time. So I don't know whether to go through the example that Reb Meir Simcha quotes over here from Parshas Vayeira. He also has an example from Sefer Shmuel. I think I'm going to choose, in this case, to leave that for the end of the Shiur, if time allows. But at this point, what I'd like to do with you is take a look at the next paragraph in the Meshech Chochma, which is also on the same 2 words, V'hu Acharav. The Medrash says that Ze Yishmael. It's interesting because in the previous paragraph, it was Yitzchak. Ze, meaning this son that she's going to beget, that's going to be Acharav, he's going to be a replacement. and it's going to be Yitzchak as opposed to Yishmael. But now Rabbi Simcha wants to interpret the opinion of the Medrash. And according to the Medrash, this Acharov is an allusion to Yishmael. What is the Medrash interested in? Mipnei hayichud. What does this mean, mipnei hayichud? There's an Iser yichud, which means that a man is not allowed to be in a private place with a woman that's not his wife. And Sarah had her famous ohel. And in this ohel, she used to invite many, many guests. Sometimes they were women, sometimes they were men. And if a man would come into the ohel, there was a problem perhaps of yichud. The Gemara at the end of Meshechech Kedushin tells us that there was a gzeira of yichud. And the Chazal were afraid that if a man and a woman are alone in a private place, it might lead to intimacy. So the Medrash derives from a hu acharav that Yishmael was the chaperone. He was appointed to remain in the ohel in such a way that if a man came in, there would be no Isa Yichud. And who appointed Yishmael to give him this task? It was none other than Avraham Avinu himself. And it's interesting, says Rabbi Simcha, that the Gemara in Meshechech Kedushin, after delineating all the specific laws of Yichud, it closes with the following statement: Matzidu sha'asa Avraham Avinu kol haTorah kula ad shelo nitna. That we find that Avraham Avinu fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given. And the Gemara bases this on the pasuk that says, Ekev asher shama Avram b'koli v'yishmar mishmarti mitzvosai v'chukosai v'sorosai. So Chazal tell us that the word v'yishmar mishmarti refers to the gzeros d'Rabbana, that not only did Avraham Avinu fulfill all the 613 mitzvos, in addition, to top it off, he fulfilled the gzeros of the Chachamim. And that's derived from the word v'yishmar mishmarti. So Meir Simcha wants to ask, why does the Gemara, after this very long, intricate sugya, detailing the laws of Yichud, and there are many complicated laws, at the end of this sugya, the Gemara goes off on what seems to be an irrelevant tangent to discuss Avraham Avinu and the fact that he was Mekayim the entire Torah, including the Gzeres D'Rabbanan. As we say in modern Hebrew, Ma Kesha. Well, what's the connection? So Meir Simcha comes up with a very original idea. He says the following: Avram Hemidis Yishmael, Avram gave the task to Yishmael, Lios Shelo Tisyachid Sarah, that Sarah should not be alone, in this context with the Malach. Again, did they know he was a Malach? They didn't know he was a Malach. They thought he was a human being. He was not allowed to be alone together with Sarah in a private ohel. And therefore, Lachein Kasuv, therefore the Pasuk says about Avram Avinu, the Yishmar, which Chazal in the same sug of Yichud darshan to mean that he created this Yichud Iser. He was involved in instituting an enactment, the Gzeir of Yichud, and Zeo Siag LaTorah. So the word Mishmeres LeMishmarti means Siag LaTorah. So Reb Meir Simcha is suggesting that after the Gemara presents all the details of the laws of this Gzeira called Yichud, now the Gemara tops it off and tells us that the Gzeira of Yichud dates back to the time of Avram Avinu. He himself, Avram, was sure to be Mekayim this Iser Gzeira D'Rabbanan of Yichud, and therefore Avram Avinu appoints Yishmael to make sure and guarantee that he be the chaperone of Mother Sarah, so that no one would violate the Iser Yichud. And Rameir Simcha says that although our Girsa in the Gemara Kedushin has the word she'asa Avram Avinu as kol haTorah kula. He says there's another girsa which says shekiyem kol haTorah kula. And Rav Meir Simcha in this context prefers the girsa of shekiyem kol haTorah kula. Because what is the word shekiyem? Kiyem means to give kiyum. To give kiyum means to give sustenance, to maintain and make sure that the mitzvahs will be fulfilled. So when the Torah describes Avram Avinu as the Yishmar Mishmarti, what it means is that Avram was Makayim all the mitzvahs, meaning he made sure that all the mitzvahs would be maintained, would be observed, would be fulfilled. And how did he do so? By instituting Gzeros that would be fences around the mitzvahs and make sure and guarantee that the mitzvahs would be fulfilled. And our pasuk V'hu Acharav is a wonderful example that personifies Avram Avinu as the person who's Makayim the Torah, keeps the Torah going. And that's why the Gemara, he says in Masechta Yevamos, on Daf Chaf Aleph, quotes Rav Kahana in the sugya of Shnios Larayos. Those are women who are not technically an erva, that you're not allowed to marry because you might lead to mistakenly marry a woman who's an erva. And the Gemara darshans a pasuk, V'shamartem es mishmarti asu mishmeres l'mishmarti. That the source for Gzeros D'Rabbanan, as the Mishnah says at the beginning of Avos Asu Siyag LaTorah, the source for that is a biblical statement of Ushmartem es mishmarti. Notice the same language of Ushmartem es mishmarti that's being used by the Torah here in our parsha to describe Avram Avinu, that he is the one who's Yishmar Mishmarti, which means that he sets up enactments, fences around the Torah, Gzeros. And this is, in our context, a perfect example of Avram's ability and his success at maintaining the Torah itself by enacting Gzeros. And when the Gemara says that Avram Avinu was Makayim the Torah before it was given, that's called an Eino Mitzvah V'Yosef. A person who's not obligated but volunteers to fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah when he's not obligated. Avram Avinu is not obligated to the Torah. He's before our Sinai. Now, says Rav Meir Simcha, the Gemara tells us that Gadol HaMitzvah V'Yosef Mimishi Eino Mitzvah V'Yosef. It's greater if you're obligated. Avram wasn't obligated. What's greater about a person who fulfills the Torah when he's obligated? Tosfos explains there in Masechta Kiddushin that his greatness is that the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, attacks a mitzvah. When the Yetzer Hara knows that you're obligated in the mitzvah, that's when the Yetzer Hara works overtime to try to dissuade you and seduce you not in a different direction, not to fulfill the mitzvah. Therefore, Rav Meir Simcha says that Avram Avinu is really setting up a Kal V'chomer, because since he's an Eino Mitzvah V'Yosef, he doesn't have the Yetzer Hara that's trying to trip him up. And Madach, in the case of Avram Avinu, he doesn't have the Yetzer Hara to overcome, and yet he sets up a Siyag LaTorah. He institutes a Gzeira. How much more so us, we who have a mitzvah, an obligation, and therefore we have the Yetzer Hara to contend with, we certainly need to fulfill this dictum of Asu Siyag LaTorah, of creating a fence around the Torah. I would ask you now to fast forward to Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud Tes. And we'll read the Pasuk inside, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling us why he chooses Avram. Ki yadativ, because I know him, says God, L'man asher yitzav es bonav es beiso achra v'shamru derech Hashem lasos tzedakah u'mishpat. Because I know about Avram Avinu that he will pass on the legacy of tzedakah u'mishpat. So Rav Meir Simcha wants to understand what's the emphasis here on the word yidativ. God is saying, I know about Avram Avinu. Normally, when God describes something, he would say Omar, Omar Hashem. Instead, Yad Hashem, God knows. And Rabbi Simcha, based on the Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva, is going to give us a fundamental distinction between Yedias Hashem, that which God knows, as opposed to that which God declares. Here, when the pasuk HaKadosh Baruch Hu is describing Avram Avinu, it's only because of the idea of Hashem. It's not an amira. There's no declaration that he, Avram Avinu, will be mitzaveh bonov achra. Why? Ki im Omar Hashem. If God would have made a pronouncement that Avram Avinu yitzaveh bonov, etc., then halo haya muchrach umechuya. But Yedias Hashem Yisbarach Eino Machriach Es HaBechira. Kamo shekosav Rambam b'Sefer Hamad. Here's the difference between Yediah and Amira. Once God declares something, then it has to come about. And that takes away from a person his freedom of choice. Had God declared about Avram that he would pass on the legacy to his children, his generations, then Avram would have no freedom of choice. Therefore, the pasuk says it wasn't an amira. God didn't say this. There was no enunciation, but rather it was Yediah. And Yedias Hashem does not force a person and rob him of his freedom of choice. And this is based on the Rambam in the 5th parak of Hilchos Tshuva, which is a chapter that's dedicated to the concept of freedom of choice. And the Rambam raises the question, Shema Tomar Halo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yodea Kol Ma Sheyeh Kodem Sheyeh. God knows what's going to happen in the future. So how can there be freedom of choice? He says that we don't understand. God's Yediyah is not a human Yediyah. He says, Ein banu koach leida heich yada Hashem. What is the quality, the essence of Yedias Hashem? Es kol bruim v'es kol amas. Avol neda, he says, what we have to know is that Maisa ha'adam biyada adam, man has freedom of choice. V'yen HaKadosh Baruch Hu moshcho, v'lo gozer all of lasos kach v'kach, because the divine knowledge is fundamentally and qualitatively different than human knowledge. And God and his knowledge are one, and that's a different kind of a knowledge, and that doesn't force anything or anyone to do anything that God knows is going to in fact happen. So God's knowledge is something separate from man's choice. Man is still granted freedom of choice. And therefore, L'man asher yitzaveh means that Avram has the freedom of choice. He can do this or he cannot do this, because it's only Yedativ, it's only God's Yediyah. There's no Hechrech, and God doesn't rob you of your Bechira based on his Yediyah. Had God made a pronouncement, that would be a Gzeira that has to come about, and then it would be impossible for Avram Avinu to have been other than L'man asher yitzaveh banav. He would be robbed of his freedom of choice. And now I'd like you to fast forward to the third piece that Rameir Simcha offers on this very same pasuk, and that is Ki Yedativ L'man asher yitzav es banav es beiso achra. Now, the word yitzaveh comes from the language mitzvah. What mitzvah is Avram Avinu fulfilling with regard to banav hu bnei beiso? Maybe banav is his sons, maybe beiso is his daughters. Ine chinuch mitzvah. He says from this pasuk we should derive the conclusion that chinuch, which means that a father has to train his children and prepare them for mitzvahs, is a mitzvah saseh. And that's pretty wild. I mean, we know there's a mitzvah to teach Torah, v'shinantom levanecha, but there's no source in the Torah for the mitzvah of chinuch, which means that I have to train my child and teach him how to shake a lulav, how to eat matzah. Says Rav Meir Simcha, there's a source in the Torah for the mitzvah of chinuch, and that makes mitzvah of chinuch into a mitzvah say. Even though lo nizkar, it's not mentioned explicitly anywhere in the Torah, but it's here in our apostle. In the Torah explicitly, we only have limadatem espedechem, mishinantu lanecha, and that's the source of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, to teach the entire gamut of Torah and all its knowledge, all its conceptual ideas and principles. But what about training my child to fulfill a mitzvah? That's called chinuch. And the Gemara tells us in the Masechta Nazir, the of chayav lechanech beno b'mitzvahs, a father has to train his son in mitzvahs. What's the source for that? It's right here in our pasuk. Leman asher yitzave es bonav es b'nei beis ha'akrov. Avram is the mechanech, par excellence, perhaps. Now, there's an entire discussion and a debate regarding a mother, whether she's obligated in the same mitzvah of chinuch to train her children. Many poskim say, Eina isha chayeves lechanech b'no b'mitzvos. This is an exclusive paternal obligation. And the reason they say so is because there's no separate mitzvah of chinuch, and therefore chinuch must be a branch or a subcategory, what we call a tolda, of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. A woman doesn't have to teach her son Torah. And since chinuch is a subcategory, it's an extension of the general all-inclusive mitzvah of Talmud Torah, therefore a woman is exempt from training her children in the mitzvah of chinuch. However, there are those who say that even a mother is obligated to be mechanech the children. And if that be the case, then ask the question, if a woman doesn't have to teach her son Torah, what's the logic and what's the source to derive the conclusion that nevertheless she's obligated in the mitzvah of chinuch vis-a-vis her children? And the answer, says Rav Meir Simcha, is our pasuk, because our pasuk indicates that Avram had an obligation to teach his children, and now we're going to include not only his male children, but also his female children. And it's a separate mitzvah, independent of Talmud Torah. And therefore it's not bound by the restrictions and the limitations of Talmud Torah. So even if Talmud Torah applies to a father vis-a-vis his son, not to a mother, neither to her son nor to her daughter, now we have a new mitzvah called chinuch. It's an independent mitzvah. It's a category unto itself with its own rules and regulations. And Makoro, and the source for this mitzvah, is the pasuk of Avram Avinu Shetziva es benov hakot bekatnom ala mitzvahs. And as Shlomo Melech says in Mishlei, Chanoch Linar al pi darko, and the Rambam in Hilchos Macholos Asuros writes that the mitzvah of chinuch is midivrei Kabbalah. Midivrei Kabbalah sounds like it's more than just a rabbinic enactment. It's somewhere derived from psukim in the Tanakh. And the answer is Ikar me Avram. We should derive it from Avram, because Asher Yitzav es bonav es b'nei beiso achra. V'mashma sha'af lebanos mitzvah la'av, that the father is obligated not only to train his sons, his male children in mitzvahs, but also to train his female children, his daughters in mitzvahs. And this could be perhaps derived from our pasuk. Now, at this point,
question, please.
Yeah, please.
The fact that he's in this mitzvah of chinuch, teaching his sons and his daughters, how does that get extended to the obligation of the woman also to be involved in chinuch?
I would say the following, that if both sons and daughters are included in the mitzvah of chinuch on the receiving end, then also on the giving end. And the Gemara says the reason why a mother doesn't have to teach her children Torah is because she herself doesn't have to learn Torah. Now, if there's a mitzvah of chinuch to be mechanech the daughter, then it makes sense that the mother is also included in that mitzvah of chinuch. And all this is based on Rav Meir Simcha's radical chiddush that is a separate category, a separate source for the mitzvah of chinuch. It's not just a detail and a subcategory of the mitzvah of limadatem osam es benechem. Now, I'd like you to fast forward for a moment to Perek Yud Ches Pasuk Chav Dalet. And at this point, we're heavy into the Parsha of stone, the destruction of stone, and Avram Avinu standing as the individual who's praying on behalf of stone. So let's see if we can read the psukim inside. I have the Chumash here. Let me just. Okay, sorry. Now, as you'll recall, Avram Avinu is pleading the case of stone. Maybe there are X number of tzaddikim in stone. And if you look carefully at the psukim, then, just one second. I'll just find the place here. Oh. In Pasuk of Dalet, he starts with the number 50. Ula yesh chamishim tzadikim b'toch ha'ir. And Rameir Simcha wants to know, what is the emphasis here on b'toch ha'ir, in the city? And it's interesting because if you look at the psukim, although he begins with b'toch ha'ir, at the end of that pasuk, pasuk of Dalet, he says asher b'kirba. So perhaps there's a difference here between b'toch ha'ir at the beginning of the pasuk and asher b'kirba at the end of the pasuk. Says Rameir Simcha. Now, if any of you have, I don't think you'll have the same edition that I have. It's on page Kuf Lamed Aleph in my edition. He says, Pirush, yesh tov muchlat, yesh tov mitzaref. He says that there are two types or categories of good. The word tov in Tanakh can have two different meanings. In one case, it's muchlat. Muchlat means it's absolute. It's objective. In other cases, it's mitzaref. Mitzaref means it's only relative. He says, b'bchinas hara hu tov. It's not really tov in and of itself, but if I compare it to evil, relative to evil, it's good. It's not good as an end to itself. For example, b'dorosov hoyet tzaddik. Noach is described as each tzaddik b'dorosav, yesh darshan l'gnai, and they say that he was only a tzaddik relative to the ra, the evildoers of his generation. That's called ra b'mitzura. Now, Rameir Simcha, describing these tzaddikim that theoretically might live in stone, and for them, on their behalf, God should save the city. He says, Zel Shamar, af im hem enam tzaddikim be'ir acheres. Even if they are only tzaddikim in the city, meaning mitzaref, they are good compared to the evil within the city. Shel keneged anshe stone hem tzaddikim. When I compare them and size them up to the stone people, they are tzaddikim. Lo tashchis. Even for the benefit of such a tzaddik, who's only a relative tzaddik, save the city. Leman chamishim hatzadikim asher bikirba. Bikirba means to emphasize that only in the city that tzaddikim. Aval be'ir acheres einam tzaddikim. So the double language here is, one is general. He opens up with the words tzaddikim b'toch ha'ir, but you don't know exactly what that means. Is it tzaddik tov muchlat? So he says asher b'kirba, because they're in the city. They size themselves up and evaluate as tzaddikim only because they're in the city. As soon as you would see them elsewhere, compare them to a more moral society, they lose their status as tzaddikim. But nevertheless, Avram says, would you, God, be willing to spare the city, even if I can find these tzaddikim that are tzaddikim asher b'kirba, they are tzaddikim of tov hamitzaref b'bchinas harahu tov. Now let's take a look at the next piece in Rameir Simcha on Pasuk Chafei. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. You are the judge of the entire globe. Will you not do justice? So claims Avram. And Rameir Simcha says, Mishum shatot shofet kol haaretz vashkafatcha makefet kol haaretz. You're able to see with your divine vision, your perspective, the entire globe. V'tachshov sdom neged ir acheres. When you compare, with the theory of relativity, stone to another city, lo timta ba tzadikim neged tzadikim acher. He says that God, because you're the shofet kol haaretz, and therefore by comparison, these are pygmies, these are dwarfs, these are the lowest of the low. Even the tzaddikim within stone are not really tzaddikim. And therefore you're going to destroy the city? Bishvil zeh lo yaseh mishpat, chalil elcha mizeh. God, instead of judging because you have the global perspective, tabit bifrat ala ir, look in a way exclusively at the city. Don't look beyond the city. If there are tzaddikim here in the city, lo tashchis, don't destroy the city. So now we understand why the Torah, why Avram Avinu in his opening statement, in his argument, he says hashofet kol haaretz, that perhaps dafka because you see the entire universe, therefore, by comparison, these so-called tzaddikim in stone are not worth saving. Now we can fast forward to Pasuk Chav Ches in the same Perek Yud Ches. Now in Pasuk Chav Ches, we really have to see the progress, the sequence of Avram's plea on behalf of stone. He opens, as we saw, with Chamishim Tzaddikim, and then in Pasuk Chav Ches, maybe they won't have 50, there'll be less than 50, and there only will be 45. And God says, I won't destroy the city, even if there are only 45. Then Avram Avinu asks 40. And Hashem says, Lo eseh bavur ha'arba'im. Notice that he doesn't repeat the word lo ashchis, but rather becomes lo eseh. Rameir Simcha is very sensitive, as you know, to the language of the Torah. Then from 40, he goes down to 50. And once again, Hashem says, Lo eseh im emtza sham shloshim. And then, when he gets down to 25, when he gets down to 20, Vayomer lo ashchis bavur ha'esrim. And so too, when he gets to Asar, lo ashchis. So it's amazing. When Avram is putting on a plea for 50 tzaddikim, Hashem says lo ashchis. When he gets down to, right, so just 1 second. So we have, I'm sorry, when he gets down to 45, we have lo ashchis. And when he lowers it down to 40 and down to 30, it's lo es. When he gets down to 20 and down to 10, it's again lo ashchis. So we have 45 is lo ashchis. We have 40 and 30 is lo ese. And 20 and 10 is lo ashchis. Ezra Meir Simcha, Hine bahanoch minyone dilakamon biarboim uchloshim amar lo ese. And what is the significance and the meaning of lo ese? Shlo yaschil lahara klal. He won't even begin to destroy. So it means ashchis is total destruction, and lo ese means I won't even begin the process of destruction. I will be esrim v'asara shaminyan muot amar lo ashchis, which means that I won't totally destroy. They have very, very narrow and limited rights over here because they're down to 20 and 10, very small numbers. So God says, lo ashchis, I won't destroy stone, but the implication is I will mete out punishment. Lassos, meaning to start at least a partial punishment process, eza onich yasa. I will protect the city from total ashchas. Ulam, masha amar lo ashchis in emtzasham arboim v'chamisha, bazeish dover gadol. He says the following. Now, if we jack it back up to 45, here HaKadosh Baruch Hu says lo ashchis. And there seems to be an impossible situation over here, because how do we play this out? If we're saying that in the case of our boy means that there's a significant number of tzaddikim, below esa. Hashem says, I won't even begin the process of punishing, because this is very, very nice amount of people. He gets down to 30, that's also a significant amount. And again, he says, lo es, I won't even begin the process of punishing. But if they have a meager claim of defense because they're down to 20 or 10, then Hashem says, lo ashchis, I won't totally destroy them, but es. Well, according to that theory, then we're stuck with 45. Because in the case of 45, the pasuk again says lo ashchis. Why not say that 45 is a greater merit than 40 or than 30? And lo ashchis means that I won't totally destroy them, but I will begin the process. Well, why? If there's 45, that's a lot better than 40 or 30. Says Rameir Simcha, bazeyesh davar gadol. Why? Because there are two concepts in punishment. This is based on the Vilna Gaon. There's one concept called din, and there's another concept called cheshbon. And it's all based on a pasuk in Mishlei. He says, "Hachet yigdal lefamim mitzad cheshbon." Sometimes the chet is greater because of what we call cheshbon. Yesh din v'yesh cheshbon. What is cheshbon? Cheshbon means that God evaluates what a person could have done had he not violated the Torah. So not only did he violate the Vayeira, and that's called din, but he should be punished also for the lack of a mitzvah that he could have done in place of that Vayeira. V'nidon gamaz al zeh. Oh, he says now, kevan sheyesh tisha va'asiri shemashlim notel keneged kulam. The Gemara says in Bracha, Staf Mem Zayin, that if you have 9 people, yeah, everybody says, "Oh, you're the center." What's so important about being the center? The Gemara says that the center gets schar for all, equal to all the other 9, because he was mashlim. He made a new entity, and he says the following: Hachet gadol shalonis orer echad lahashlim liasara lios adas tzadikim. He says, for whenever the possibility exists that that person would add the number and go from 9 to 10, then there would have been a possibility of jacking it up to a level called Adas Tzadikim. And that community of Tzadikim can achieve greater mitzvahs with a greater reward and of a quality that's superior. And therefore, he says, Lachein mitzad ha'cheshbon gadol ha'onesh. V'lachein lo yachshis aval yiser osam shalonis oru lahashlim liasara. So whenever it says lo yashchis, right? So let's go over this. When does it say lo yashchis? It says 45, which means that there will be some punishment. When it's 40, then it's lo esa, 40 or 30. So what happens with the numbers 40 and 30? In the cases of 40 and 30, we already have divisions of 10. So that the tzaddikim cannot be held responsible for not creating a das tzaddikim of 10, because there already was an Eidah of 10, 20, 30, and 40. But now he says, what happens if, right? So he says, Aval barboim shayachasel chol ir shnei anoshim in kein kol echad. Oh, okay. Now we have to divide by 5. There were 5 cities of stone, and all total, there were 40 tzaddikim, let's say, in that argument. So now, if you divide 40 by 5, you have 8. So no particular tzaddik could say that I could have been mashal in the minyan, because even adding another to the number 8, you get 9. But on the other hand, if the number is 45, right? Just 1 second. I just want to make sure I got this. Last night at midnight, I understood this. 1 second. If the number is 45, just 1 second. Is HaKadosh Baruch Hu says lo ashchis, right? So lo ashchis means that there's an additional element of punishment because of cheshbon. Why? Because if you take the number 45 and divide it amongst the 5 cities, then if in each city there would have been 1 extra tzaddik, then we would have had the number 50. So we could have had an adas tzaddikim. And then he goes on in the next paragraph. I'm just fast forwarding because I still have another important piece I want to share with you. He says, right? It says in Avos, and it says, if they mias to osid litain din v'cheshbon, and the Gra describes din v'cheshbon. Okay. Now, I'd like you to fast forward to Yud Tes Pasuk Yud Gimel, and this is where we're gonna wrap it up. Yud Tes Pasuk Yud Gimel and Pasuk Yud Dalet. It says the following. The Malachim tell Lot that they have come, Ki mashchisem anachnu es hamakom hazeh. And then they say, Vayishalchenu Hashem l'shachasa, Vayetze Lot vayidaber el chasanov. When Lot gets the word from the Malachim that the city is going to be destroyed, he goes out to his sons-in-law, Lot ched v'nosav, Vayomer kumu tze'u min hamakom hazeh, Ki mashchis Hashem es ha'ir, Vayihi kimitzachek b'einei chasanov. It's very interesting. At the beginning of Pasuk Yud, it says Vayidaber el chasanov, and then it says Vayomer. So Meir Simcha wants to know what's Vayidaber and what's Vayomer. He could have said Vayidaber es chasanov lo b'no kumu te'u, or Vayomer el chasanov. But Meir Simcha opens up this presentation by asking a question. Chazal tell us that because the Malachim said Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh, they were punished, and for 138 years the Malachim were out of service, so to speak. They only came back when Yaakov Avinu had the dream, and there were Malachim that were climbing up the ladder. Those were the Malachim that were absent for this whole period of time, 138 years, as a punishment because they said the words Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh. So Meir Simcha wants to know why are the Malach Yeshua guilty because they said Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh? That's exactly what they were sent for. That's their shlichus. He says no. They shouldn't have said Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh because that is a definitive declaration. And once the Malachim said, Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh, there was no possibility of tshuva. Because, as we said before, once the machshava gets to the level of Amira and Dibur, then there's no freedom of choice. So the Malachim had overstepped their bounds when they declared in a definitive way, Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes there, l'ra, and he can always change it through tshuva. And this is the Rambam in Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah Perek Yud, that no matter what Zera HaKadosh Baruch Hu decrees, as long as it's begetter machshava, there's always room to rip up that Zera if the people do tshuva. Ein ze gzar din she'eino nikra klal, the Zera of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though he's made that decision, can be reversed. Aval davar nimsa al malachim, if the malachim now are given a shlichus and they formulate and verbalize that shlichus, then it's the gzar din ubal yachol ishtaras, it can never be reversed. Why? Because once the created beings make a statement, and if that statement is based on what they heard from God in a prophecy, like in this case of the shlichus and malachim, therefore, it's impossible for that decree to be reversed. And the Malachim here, when they said Ki mashchisim anachnu es hamakom hazeh, they clinched it in such a way that it became impossible to undo that edict of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the destruction of Sodom. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not happy with this because, just like in the case of Nineveh, although God had decreed that he would destroy the city of Nineveh, nevertheless he waited for them to do tshuva. But now that the Malachim said, Mashchisim anachnu, it became a davar behechlet, and there's no room for tshuva. Shalu abachira, there's no room for freedom of choice, and it's a gzar din she'eino nikra, and no'alu darkei tshuva. However, Lot was under a different impression. Why? Because the Malachim said two things. They said Ki mashchisim anachnu, and at the end of that pasuk, Vayishalchenu Hashem l'shachasa, and God sent us to destroy the city. That's pasuk Yud Gimel that we saw before. Rabbi Simcha wants to know what's the difference between the opening of the pasuk Ki mashchisim anachnu And the end of the pasuk, Vayishalchenu Hashem l'shachasa. Lot understood that Vayishalchenu Hashem l'shalcha means that our power is limited and it's prescribed by the shlichus. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sending these malachim as the shlichim, then for sure there's room for tshuva to undermine this edict. That was Lot's impression. Sof divreihem, because they said Vayishalchenu Hashem l'shachasa. Now Lot understands Hadayim tshuva moil. There's still room for tshuva. Ki lazeh shalach osam Hashem Yisparach. Part of the shlichus is to influence and inspire the people to do tshuva, like Yonah. Lachen vayetze Lot vayedaber el chasana. If God's shlichus here, the shlichus of malachim, is to bring about a situation where the people of stone would do tshuva, like the case of Nineveh, then I understand what the pasuk means at the reisha of the pasuk when it says, "Vayidaber Lot, vayetze Lot, vayidaber al chasanav." Here the emphasis is on dibur, and Lot was now asking of his sons-in-law that they should use dibur, they should use their power of persuasion. Since Noach was still holding out optimism that this shlichus was done in such a way that the people should do tshuva, he now places a mission, a task on the shoulders of his sons-in-law, and Vayidaber Chasanov means go and speak to the people. And if you'll succeed, the people will do tshuva. And then, at the end of the same pasuk, Vayomer kumu tzeu min hamakom ki mashchus Hashem esa'ir. In other words, Lot, since he was convinced that the Gzar Din could be rescinded, could be revoked, and he saw that maybe his sons-in-law would not be successful with the power of persuasion to use their mouth and their dibur, so he says, you know what? Make a demonstration. Pack your bags and move out of the city. And then people are going to ask you, why are you moving out of the city? It's like when Noach built the Teva, they asked him, why are you building a Teva? And therefore, perhaps leaving the city would be more effective than trying to convince them to do tshuva. In other words, as long as you talk is cheap. They're not going to think that you're serious about it. They're going to laugh you out of the. But if you pack your bags and you demonstrate how much you believe that the city of stone will be destroyed, then maybe you'll be ma'or them to tshuva. And that's the vayomer. You begin to understand perhaps why the pasuk opens up with Vayidaber and then closes with Vayomer. Dibur is lashon kasha. It's a harsh language. Give them stark musar. Tell them that their ways are evil and God has decided to destroy stone. But then if that doesn't work, then it's Vayomer. Then we'll try something softer, a softer landing approach, and pack your bags and see if that demonstration will get the word across, get the message, and they will understand that this is actually going to take place. They'll do tshuva. Lachen ksiv vayidaber el chasanov vayomer kumu ki hoya bazeh shnei inyanim. That the Vayidaber at the beginning of the pasuk and the Vayomer at the end are two different dimensions, both of which had the same ultimate goal, to be ma'or them to tshuva. But the Malachim, unfortunately, and this Lot didn't understand, had already put the nail into the coffin because they declared ki mashchitzim onu es hamakom hazeh, and then there was no room for freedom of choice or for tshuva.
Wouldn't you think to go softly first, and then if you have no choice, you go harsher?
Well, I think it's important to go harsh first because you first have to demonstrate to the people why God would have made this decision and issue the edict of the destruction. So for that, you need starka musa. You have to tell them that your ways are so immoral, that you're guilty of the most hideous crimes. You're destroying human life. That's a vayidaber. And if they don't get the message and they're still skeptical, then maybe try a softer approach. Okay, then?
May I ask a question going
Yes,
back
please.
to Pei Yud Ches Pasuk Yud Tes Ki Yadativ? Yeah, so the Rav told us two different ideas from the Meshechech.
Two different approaches.
Yeah, what was it? Are they contrary approaches? Look like they're contrary because in the first one, you suggested Kiyadativ, it leaves Bechira, it's not a tzivoy.
Right.
In the second one, you said that chinuch is from here we see chinuch is a mitzvah. It seems to be it's in the same pasuk. How can it be Bechira and mitzvah in the same pasuk?
No, well, what Rav Simcha is saying is that on the one hand, Hashem knows about Avram Avinu, but then when it says Yitzav es Bonov, that's already a lashon of a mitzvah. So God knows in the future that Avram Avinu will fulfill this mitzvah. That knowledge of God is different than knowledge as we know it, and therefore it doesn't force or coerce someone and rob him of his freedom of choice. But in fact, Hashem is now telling Avram Avinu something else. I know that there's a mitzvah that I'm giving you now, and that you in fact will come through in flying colors. You'll fulfill that mitzvah. I rely on you. But I don't force you. It's only a yediyah. It's not an amira. But you should know, Yitzave es Bonav. Avram Avinu is the first person to institute the mitzvah of chinuch, and that becomes the source for the mitzvah of chinuch for all dogs.
Yeah.
Okay then, so I wish everyone a great Shabbos Parshas Vayeira, and thank you for joining me today. If we had more time, but I have a Daf Yomi Shiur now that I have to go to, I would have actually given you a little bit of a summary of the 8 different pieces in Rav Simcha that we covered today. Each one with a brilliant idea. As always, the man is just so original. It's just almost beyond human comprehension.